Picture this. You're an intelligent, rational, well-educated person. You have principles, you have self-control, you think for yourself. Now place yourself in a crowd, a protest, a rally, a mob, even a stadium, and according to one of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century, you essentially cease to exist. Your intelligence drops, your individuality dissolves, you become a kind of automaton, swept up in collective emotion, capable of heroism you'd never attempt alone and savagery you'd never dream of in private. You don't just join the crowd, you become the crowd. And the crowd is not simply the sum of its members. It's something else entirely. Something more primitive, more emotional, more dangerous, and more powerful than any single person within it. That is the central, provocative, and deeply unsettling thesis of Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd, published in 1895. And here's what makes it genuinely eerie. This book, written over a century ago, reads like a manual for understanding the age of social media, viral outrage, political demagoguery, and mass movements. Le Bon argued that the age of crowds had arrived, that reasoned individual thought was giving way to collective sentiment, and that whoever learned to manipulate the crowd would hold the keys to power. He was writing about the French Revolution and the Paris Commune, but he might as well have been writing about Twitter mobs, populist rallies, and the strange psychological alchemy that turns ordinary people into fervent believers or destroyers. The question the book forces you to confront is uncomfortable. How much of what you think you believe is actually yours, and how much of it was planted there by the invisible pressure of the crowd around you? Gustave Le Bon was born in 1841 in Nogent-le-Rotrou, a small town in north-central France. He trained as a physician, but medicine was only the launching pad for a restlessly curious mind that refused to stay in one lane. Over his lifetime, Le Bon wrote about physics, anthropology, horse training, the psychology of socialism, the nature of matter, and the civilizations of the Arab world and India. He was, in the truest sense, a polymath, though his critics would sometimes use a less flattering word, dilettante. He moved through fields with confidence, sometimes brilliance, and occasionally with the kind of sweeping generalizations that made specialists wince. But it was crowd psychology that made him famous. And to understand why he wrote The Crowd, you need to understand the France he lived in. Le Bon came of age during one of the most turbulent centuries in French history. The Revolution of 1789 had unleashed forces that kept reverberating. Through the Napoleonic era, the revolutions of 1830 and 1848, the catastrophic Franco-Prussian War of 1870, and the terrifying Paris Commune of 1871, where ordinary Parisians rose up, seized the city, and were eventually crushed in a bloodbath. Le Bon witnessed a society repeatedly torn apart by mass movements, and he became obsessed with a question: why do crowds behave the way they do? Why do civilized people, when gathered together, commit acts of destruction and cruelty that none of them would commit alone? He published The Crowd, a study of the popular mind, in 1895, and the timing was perfect. Europe was entering a period of mass politics, labor movements, socialist agitation, anarchist violence, the rise of nationalism. The old aristocratic order was crumbling and democracy was expanding. Le Bon looked at all of this and saw not progress but peril. He was, politically, a conservative, deeply skeptical of democracy, suspicious of socialism, and frankly elitist in his view of human nature. This is important to understand because it colors everything in the book. He wasn't writing as a neutral scientist. He was writing as a man alarmed by what he saw as the growing power of the irrational masses. The book was an immediate sensation. It was translated into dozens of languages and became one of the most widely read works of social psychology ever written. Its influence was staggering and troubling. Theodore Roosevelt read it. Mussolini reportedly studied it carefully. There are strong reasons to believe Hitler drew on its ideas when crafting his propaganda strategies in Mein Kampf. Sigmund Freud engaged with it seriously in his own work on group psychology. Edward Bernays, the father of modern public relations, was deeply influenced by Le Bon's insights about how crowds can be guided through appeals to emotion and image rather than reason. The reception has always been mixed. Scholars praise the book's psychological insights while criticizing its lack of empirical rigor, its racial theories, and its aristocratic disdain for ordinary people. On Goodreads, it hovers around 3.8 out of 5. Respected, widely read, but polarizing. Some readers find it prophetic, others find it elitist and dated. Both reactions are legitimate, and both miss something if taken alone. The book matters today not because Le Bon got everything right, he didn't, but because the phenomena he described have not gone away. If anything, they've intensified. In an era of algorithmically amplified outrage, echo chambers, and viral movements that can form and dissolve in hours, Le Bon's century-old warnings about the psychology of crowds feel less like history and more like a weather report. Let's get into the substance of what Le Bon actually argues, because the ideas here are layered and interconnected in ways that reward careful attention. The first and most fundamental idea is what Le Bon calls the psychological crowd. And this is crucial. He's not just talking about a bunch of people standing in the same place. 1,000 individuals walking through a train station are not a crowd in Le Bon's sense. A crowd forms when individual consciousness gives way to a shared collective mind. It happens when people's emotions synchronize, when they begin to feel and act as one organism rather than as separate individuals. Le Bon describes this as a kind of mental unity. The conscious personality vanishes, he says. Feelings and ideas take the same direction. A collective mind forms. Temporary, but immensely powerful. What makes this happen? Le Bon identifies 3 key mechanisms. The first is anonymity. When you're part of a crowd, you feel invisible. The sense of personal responsibility dissolves. You wouldn't throw a rock through a window alone, but in a surging mob with no one watching you specifically, the restraint evaporates. The second mechanism is contagion. Emotions and behaviors spread through a crowd the way a virus spreads through a body. One person's panic becomes everyone's panic. One person's rage ignites a fire that sweeps through thousands. Le Bon compares this to hypnosis. The individual in a crowd enters a state of heightened suggestibility, almost like a sleepwalker, responding to the emotional current rather than to rational thought. The third mechanism is suggestibility itself. In the crowd state, people become extraordinarily open to ideas planted by leaders or by the prevailing mood. Critical thinking shuts down. The crowd doesn't analyze, it feels, it doesn't debate, it believes. This leads directly to the second big idea. The crowd is intellectually inferior to the individual, but emotionally more intense. Le Bon is blunt about this, and it's one of his most controversial claims. He argues that when people form a psychological crowd, the group's intelligence drops to the level of its least sophisticated members. Complex reasoning is impossible in a crowd. Nuance disappears. What remains is raw emotion, fear, rage, enthusiasm, devotion. The crowd can be heroic. It can be savage. What it cannot be is thoughtful. Le Bon uses the example of revolutionary juries during the French Terror. These were composed of ordinary citizens, shopkeepers, tradesmen, people who in their individual lives were perfectly decent. But as a crowd, as a collective body, swept up in revolutionary fervor, they sent innocent people to the guillotine with terrifying ease. They weren't evil individuals. They were individuals who had surrendered their individual judgment to the crowd mind, and the crowd mind was merciless. This doesn't mean crowds are always destructive, though. Le Bon acknowledges, sometimes grudgingly, that crowds are also capable of extraordinary self-sacrifice, courage, and generosity. A mob can burn a building, but a crowd can also charge a battlefield or give their lives for a cause. The point is that these actions are driven by emotion, not by reason. The crowd doesn't calculate costs and benefits. It acts on impulse, magnified 1,000-fold by collective energy. The third major idea is perhaps the most practically relevant: the role of leaders and the tools they use to control crowds. Le Bon argues that every crowd is in effect looking for a master. Left to itself, a crowd is chaotic. But introduce a leader, someone with prestige, conviction, and the right kind of charisma, and the crowd becomes an instrument. Le Bon describes the characteristics of effective crowd leaders with a precision that feels almost clinical. They are not great thinkers. In fact, Le Bon says, thinkers make poor leaders of crowds because they see too many sides of an issue. They hesitate. They qualify. The effective crowd leader is a person of action, of narrow but intense conviction. Someone who can embody an idea with such force that the crowd catches fire. and the tools these leaders use are specific. Le Bon identifies three primary instruments: affirmation, repetition, and contagion. Affirmation means stating things simply and boldly, without evidence, without nuance, without qualification. The crowd doesn't want proof, it wants certainty. Repetition is the hammering of that affirmation over and over until it lodges in the mind like a splinter. Le Bon observed that an idea repeated enough times takes on the character of truth, regardless of its actual relationship to reality. And contagion is the spread of that idea from person to person, powered by emotion and social pressure, until it becomes the unquestioned assumption of the group. If you're thinking this sounds exactly like modern political messaging, advertising, and social media dynamics, you're right. Le Bon described the playbook more than a century before anyone had a Twitter account. The fourth idea concerns the role of images, words, and illusions rather than facts. Le Bon argues that crowds think in images, not in logic. Abstract ideas have no power over a crowd unless they are condensed into vivid, concrete images. A political slogan works not because of its intellectual content, but because of the emotional picture it paints. Liberty, equality, fraternity. These words, Le Bon notes, carried enormous power during the French Revolution, but they meant vastly different things to different people. That was precisely their strength. Vague, evocative words can unite a crowd precisely because everyone projects their own meaning onto them. A rigorous, carefully defined argument would divide the crowd because people would start disagreeing about specifics. The image, the slogan, the myth, these unite by bypassing the rational mind entirely. Le Bon extends this into a broader theory about how beliefs take hold in civilization. He argues that the great drivers of history are not facts or reason, but illusions. Shared beliefs, myths, religious convictions, ideological visions. Crowds don't follow truth. They follow what feels true. And what feels true is whatever speaks to their emotions, their fears, their hopes. This is why Le Bon argues religions have always been more powerful social forces than philosophies. Religion speaks in images and stories. Philosophy speaks in arguments. The crowd will always choose the story. The fifth idea is Le Bon's taxonomy of different types of crowds and how they behave. He distinguishes between criminal crowds, electoral crowds, juries, and parliamentary assemblies, among others. Each has its own dynamics, but they all share the fundamental characteristics of the crowd mind. His analysis of parliamentary assemblies is particularly biting. He argues that even elected bodies, supposedly the pinnacle of reasoned democratic deliberation, function in many ways like crowds. Members are swayed by prestige, by emotional appeals, by the desire to conform. They vote based on sentiment and party loyalty rather than careful analysis. The great parliamentary debates, Le Bon suggests, are often theater, performances designed to move the emotional crowd of legislators rather than to illuminate truth. This is a deeply cynical view, but anyone who has watched legislative proceedings with honest eyes will recognize at least a grain of truth in it. The sixth, and perhaps most sweeping idea, is Le Bon's theory of civilizational cycles and the role of crowds in history. He believed that civilizations follow a predictable arc. They are built by small elites, people of intelligence, discipline, and vision. Over time, the ideas of these elites filter down and become the shared beliefs of the masses. But as the masses gain power, they transform and eventually degrade these ideas. The crowd, being driven by emotion rather than reason, eventually destroys the very institutions that created the civilization's greatness. Le Bon saw the rise of mass democracy, socialism, and popular movements as symptoms of civilizational decline. The crowd overtaking the elite, emotion overtaking reason, destruction overtaking creation. This is the most politically loaded part of the book, and it's where Le Bon's conservative elitism is most nakedly on display. He viewed the growing power of ordinary people with something close to horror. For him, the crowd was not a democratic ideal to be celebrated. It was a force of nature to be understood and, if possible, managed, but never trusted with the levers of power. And yet, even here, there's an insight buried beneath the prejudice. Le Bon recognized something that many democratic theorists were reluctant to face, that collective decision-making is not inherently rational, that groups can be manipulated, that popular sentiment is not the same thing as wisdom. These are uncomfortable truths, and we ignore them at our peril. So what does Le Bon get right, and where does he go wrong? Let's be honest about both, because this book deserves it. What he gets right is remarkable for a work written in 1895. His core psychological insights about crowd behavior have been confirmed by more than a century of subsequent research. Social psychologists from Freud to Philip Zimbardo to Solomon Asch have documented exactly the phenomena Le Bon described: de-individuation, social contagion, conformity pressure, the reduction of individual critical thinking in group settings. The Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram obedience studies, research on groupthink, all of these echo Le Bon's central claim that group dynamics can override individual judgment in powerful and sometimes terrifying ways. His understanding of propaganda techniques, affirmation, repetition, emotional imagery, is startlingly prescient. He essentially described the mechanics of modern advertising, political communication, and social media manipulation decades before any of these things existed in their current forms. When you watch a demagogue work a rally, when you see a hashtag become a movement overnight, when you witness how a single emotional image can shift public opinion more than 100 carefully reasoned arguments, you are watching Le Bon's theories play out in real time. But the book has serious problems, and intellectual honesty demands we name them. First, Le Bon's methodology is essentially non-existent by modern standards. He offers no controlled studies, no systematic data, no rigorous empirical foundation. His evidence consists of historical anecdotes, personal observations, and sweeping generalizations. He writes with the confidence of a man who has figured everything out, but much of his framework is assertion dressed up as science. Second, his view of crowds is overwhelmingly negative and one-dimensional. Modern research on collective intelligence, the wisdom of crowds documented by James Surowiecki and others, shows that groups can, under the right conditions, make better decisions than individuals. Le Bon barely acknowledges this possibility. He sees crowds as almost always irrational, almost always dangerous, and this blinds him to the genuinely positive potential of collective action. Third, and this must be said plainly, Le Bon's racial theories are deeply offensive and scientifically baseless. He believed in a rigid hierarchy of races, with some inherently superior to others, and he applied this framework to his analysis of crowds and civilizations. These ideas were common in his era, but that context does not excuse them. They represent a fundamental intellectual failure, and any modern reader must recognize them as such. Fourth, his elitism, while occasionally yielding genuine insights about the limits of democratic deliberation, ultimately undermines his analysis. He assumes that elites are inherently more rational and more capable than ordinary people, an assumption that history has disproven spectacularly and repeatedly. Elites are perfectly capable of groupthink, irrationality, and self-destructive behavior. The financial crisis of 2008, engineered by the supposed intellectual cream of the financial world, is just one of countless examples. Finally, Le Bon treats the crowd as a monolithic phenomenon, when in reality, different types of groups behave in vastly different ways depending on their composition, their goals, their structure, and the information available to them. A lynch mob and a town hall meeting are both crowds, but the psychological dynamics are profoundly different. Le Bon's framework is too blunt an instrument to capture these distinctions with the precision they demand. The book is best understood as a brilliant but flawed provocation, a work that asks the right questions even when it provides incomplete or biased answers. So what should you actually take away from this book and hold on to? First, be vigilant about your own susceptibility to crowd psychology. You are not immune. Nobody is. When you feel a surge of collective emotion, righteous anger on social media, tribal loyalty at a political rally, the intoxicating sense of being part of a movement, pause. Ask yourself whether you're thinking or merely feeling. Ask whether you would hold this opinion, express this outrage, share this post, if you were alone in a quiet room with time to reflect. The crowd mind is not something that only affects other people. Second, learn to recognize the tools of crowd manipulation. Bold assertions without evidence, relentless repetition, vivid emotional imagery used in place of reasoned argument. These techniques work precisely because they bypass your critical faculties. Once you can name them, they lose some of their power over you. When someone is telling you what to feel rather than what to think, that's a signal to slow down. Third, remember that collective action is not inherently bad, but it requires structure, accountability, and the preservation of individual judgment. The difference between a wise crowd and a dangerous mob often comes down to whether people within the group retain the capacity to disagree, to question, and to dissent. Any group that demands total conformity, that punishes doubt, that treats questioning as betrayal, that group has crossed the line from community into crowd in Le Bon's most troubling sense. Fourth, understand that emotional persuasion will always be more powerful than rational argument in shaping public opinion. This isn't a reason to abandon reason. It's a reason to become more sophisticated about how you communicate, how you evaluate what you're told, and how you build institutions that protect reasoned deliberation from the tidal forces of collective emotion. Le Bon wrote a single sentence that has echoed across more than a century, and it lands differently now than it did in 1895. He wrote, "The age we are about to enter will in truth be the era of crowds." He meant it as a warning. He feared what would happen when the masses gained power, when emotion replaced reason at the center of public life, when leaders learned to manipulate collective feeling rather than appeal to individual thought. Whether you share his fear or not, it's hard to look at the world today, at the velocity of viral outrage, at the power of movements that form and dissolve in the span of a news cycle, at the leaders who govern by spectacle and slogan, and argue that he was wrong about where we were headed. The crowd hasn't gone anywhere. It's just found new places to gather. And the question Le Bon left us with is still the one that matters most. In the age of crowds, how do you remain yourself?